We begin our journey with the story of Abraham. God told Abraham to go to Canaan. We read in the Bible that Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, and the traditional view holds that Ur of the Chaldeans was located in Mesopotamia. If this is in fact where Abraham came from, it's a very long journey. Here you can see on a modern map the journey of Abraham. And if somebody was traveling with a car, it would take him almost 24 hours to get from ancient Ur, located in Mesopotamia, to Israel. And this is not taking into account the different problems at the borders and other problematic stuff. So it's just straight traveling by car without stops. But I must mention here that there is a second proposed location for the Ur of Chaldeans, and that's the city of Ophrah, which is very close to Haran. The strength of this view is that in this case of a scenario, Abraham would not have to make such a big detour to Haran, but would follow a more natural way to the Promised Land. But let's leave that discussion for another episode. So, when Abraham gets to the Promised Land, God says that he will give him and his descendants this great land. God even tells Abraham how big this land will be, because we read it will be starting from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates. If the river of Egypt means the Nile River, then you can see on this picture how vast of a land this is, how big of a territory Abraham and his descendants would inherit. But the Bible doesn't exactly say that it is the Nile River, just the river of Egypt, so it could be a different river. And in that case, the territory promised to Abraham and his descendants would be probably smaller. Here, for example, in the yellow color, you can see the territory controlled by King Solomon. Solomon controlled a territory from the Sinai Peninsula up to the river Euphrates, where today modern Syria is located. The problem with this view is that in addition to the boundaries set by the rivers, God also provides the different nations and their lands that Israel will inherit. And if we look at the different nations that existed in those times, this territory would be much bigger than the land that Solomon controlled. So here, once again, you can see the different nations that were mentioned. If Israel was to inherit the land of all those nations, that would be still a very big territory. And certainly it would be larger than the territory controlled by King Solomon. Okay, but let's take the maximalist view and see how exactly big it was. So here you can see the territory from the Nile River to the Euphrates River and the size of today's Israel. As you can clearly see, Israel today controls just a fraction of this territory. So here's a map of the modern countries today and their boundaries. And here is the territory again from the river Nile to the river Euphrates. Okay, but let's compare it to some things that you may be more familiar with. So let's, for example, take the state of Texas and compare it how big it would be. So the state of Texas is about the size of the Promised Land. So the land that we mentioned from the river Nile to the river Euphrates. So this is the size of land God actually promised Israel. But let's take a different country now. Let's take, for example, the country of Kazakhstan, which is a very large country. So again, this country is a little bit bigger than the land that we mentioned from the river Nile to the Euphrates River. Okay, so let's take one more. Let's take, for example, the country of Turkey. So again, Turkey is about the size of the landmass that we mentioned, from Nile to the Euphrates River. So this perhaps gives you a better understanding of the land that perhaps was promised to Abraham. Okay, but let's move on. The next important story in Israel's history is the story of Abraham's grandchild, Jacob, and his 12 sons. And of course, in this story, the country that is very important is the country of Egypt. This story, of course, begins in Canaan, but it ends up in Egypt, because Joseph goes to see his brothers. Then, as we read, he is sold, and then he travels as a slave to Goshen, which is part of Egypt. Eventually, the whole family of Jacob moves to Egypt, and this is where the nation of Israel is created. After 430 years, the 12 sons of Jacob are transformed into a large nation. And in the book of Exodus, we read about their departure from Egypt and their return to the Promised Land. There are also several theories as to the route of the Israelis in the wilderness. I will present the three most popular ones. So first we have the so-called northern route, which goes on the north side of the Sinai Peninsula and locates Mount Sinai at Jabal Helal. Second, we have the central route, which goes through the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, goes down to the Median territory, which is today's Saudi Arabia, and then locates Mount Sinai at Jabal al-Lavs, and then goes back to Kadesh and Barnea. And then we have the southern route, which goes to the bottom part of the Sinai Peninsula and locates the Sinai mountain at Jabal Musa, and then again goes back to Kadesh and Barnea. Of course, all of those three routes, and there are many than those three, have their strengths and weaknesses, and there probably isn't one definite answer as to the exact route of the Israelis through the wilderness.
What I can definitely say is that the journey in the wilderness could have been much shorter if the Israelis trusted God. In the Bible, we read that 12 spies were sent to Canaan to check out this land. We read that 12 spies were sent, one from each tribe. And then after 40 days, they returned with a report. 10 of the spies said, yes, the land is beautiful, flowing with milk and honey, but we'll never get it. It's fortified, the people are big, we have no chance. But 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, said, yes, there are challenges, but God is with us, and we will certainly win. Unfortunately, the nation of Israel listened to the majority report. And because of their disbelief in the power of God, they were punished to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Out of this generation, only Joshua and Caleb were able to see with their own eyes the Promised Land. Even Moses was not allowed to enter. He was able to see it from Mount Nebo, but he did not enter the Promised Land. Eventually, the Israelites began their conquest of the Promised Land. And of course, this wasn't an easy task. The land did not belong to one big nation, but it was full of little tribes, warlords that controlled each city. And so, every time, every battle, it was a struggle. Of course, even before entering the land, each tribe knew exactly which part of the land is given to them by God. Here you can see the division of the land by the tribes of Israel. Of course, the reality was that Israel did not conquer all the territory that was promised to them by God. The book of Judges is full of struggles for the land, which clearly shows that the people of Israel lived in the land, but they did not control it. The situation gets more stable as Israel gets her first king. Here you can see the territory controlled by Israel under King Saul. Then you have the territory controlled by Israel under King David, and eventually the territory controlled by King Solomon. That's a very large territory if we compare it to today's Israel. The glorious days of the kingdom of Solomon did not last very long, and after Solomon died, the kingdom actually got divided into southern Judah and northern Israel. Here you can see those two kingdoms with their neighboring nations that were not very friendly to Israel. And here you can see the map of today's Israel. And here you can see the nations that surround Israel today. But as Israel was fighting her small wars, a giant danger was starting to be created. A nation that was probably the first great empire and had a huge impact on the history of Israel was Assyria. Assyrians were known for their cruel but effective way of fighting. A very important battle happened in the Karkar area. It is here that the coalition of the nation of Aram and King Ahab was defeated by the Assyrian forces. This was the final blow for the nations in the Canaan region. Assyria was going strong and was destroying everything on its path. The evil King Jehu of Israel had to become a vassal of Assyria. As Assyria was continuing its victorious march, many people from Israel and Judah were escaping to Jerusalem. Those that did not escape faced the wrath of the Assyrians. The northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and the people were exiled far east into the Assyrian territories. It was a common strategy of the Assyrians to weaken the local people by deporting them to a strange land. But then something strange happens. This great army of the Assyrian people cannot conquer Jerusalem. We only read in the records that the king of Judah was trapped like a bird in a cage. This is very strange, but when we read the Bible, we understand why it was not conquered. In the Bible we read that because of King Hezekiah's repentance and the whole nation repentance, Jerusalem was spared, and the great army of Assyria that was surrounding Jerusalem was destroyed. Of course, the proud kings of Assyria would never admit that they were defeated. And so, in their official records, they just wrote this note, that Jerusalem and its king was trapped as a bird in a cage. Unfortunately, the righteous path of the people of Judah did not last very long, and eventually Judah would also be conquered by another empire that was coming after Assyria, the great empire of Babylon. Babylon did capture Jerusalem and exiled many people in Jerusalem. There were actually 3 different attacks and deportation done by Babylon on Jerusalem. The first deportation happened in 605 BC. This is the one where to Babylon Daniel is taken. Then we have another deportation in 597, and finally in 586, this is the final destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Of course, every empire has its beginning and end, and the same happened with Babylon. After Babylon came another, even greater empire, the Persian Empire. Here you can see the progression of this great empire and how large it was. The Persian Empire not only punished Babylon for destruction of Jerusalem, but also allowed the Jewish people to return to the Promised Land. The return from Babylon also happened in stages. First, it was the King Zerubbabel's return, and then we know about the return of Ezra and Nehemiah. This allowed the Jewish people to re-establish their country before another empire would come to the stage of the world, and that's the Greek Empire. Here you can see the progression of the Greek Empire and the incredible conquest of Alexander the Great, who supposedly did not lose a single battle. Alexander the Great expanded the Greek Empire and its culture to the borders of India. And only then, when his soldiers told him, "We're tired, we want to go back home," he stopped. After which, he died very quickly. After Alexander died, his kingdom basically divided into 4 parts. The part that really interests us as far as Israel's history is the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, what we need to understand is up to this point, after the Babylonian exile, Judea was never a separate country, an independent country. That will change very soon, because as the 2 empires, the 2 kingdoms, the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom, started to fight with each other, something strange happened. The Seleucid kingdom was consistently gaining land and conquering new territories, taking them from the other 4 kingdoms. Eventually, they also got hold of the Promised Land and Jerusalem. The expansion of the Seleucid Empire was stopped by another great empire to emerge, the Romans. The Romans basically said to Antiochus Epiphanes IV of the Seleucid kingdom that he cannot take Egypt, so he had to return to the Promised Land, which he already controlled. This was a turning point for the history of Israel. Antiochus started forcing the Greek culture on the people he conquered, and in Jerusalem he was doing the same. He even ordered to sacrifice a pig in the temple in Jerusalem. That was a huge problem for the Jewish people that started rebelling against this tyranny. And that's the beginning of the so-called Maccabean revolt. On this map, you will be able to see the different stages of the Maccabean revolt and how the kingdom started to expand into the kingdom that we know in the 1st century. For the first time since the deportation to Babylon, the Jewish people were gaining independence, and finally they were controlling their land that was given to them by God once again. It's a little bit similar to the conquest of the land in the times of Joshua. And as you can see, this is a large territory, which includes the territory of the country of Jordan, for example. So Israel did control at some point much more land than they control today. So we of course mentioned Rome, and that's another empire that had a huge impact on the Jewish people and on their land. And so the independence of the Jewish people did not last long, because the Romans put procurators in the territories they controlled, and they were supreme to any local kings or governance. Of course, the Romans were not very different from the Greeks. They took the Greek culture, repackaged it, and called it their own. And it wasn't long when the Jewish people started rebelling again against the Roman boot. The first Jewish revolt started in 66 AD and inflamed the whole region. Initially, the Romans had some problems with the rebels, but the Romans are not the Greeks. Their army was far superior than the Greek one, and they knew how to deal with rebellion. The last stand of the Jewish people was Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem was very well fortified city, the Romans brought 3 legions to deal with it. And in 70 AD, the temple and the city was burned destroyed totally, and many of the Jewish people and the vessels of the temple were taken to Rome. But that was just the first chapter of the Jewish rebellion against Rome, because in 132 another Jewish revolt started. This was the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt. Emperor Hadrian had this idea of transforming Jerusalem into a modern pagan city, and so he started creating pagan temples, which once again stirred up the Jewish people who attacked the Roman forces stationed in Jerusalem. Hadrian got really angry at the Jewish people, totally destroying Jerusalem and even changing the name from Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. The whole city was just demolished. Many people were killed, not just in Jerusalem, but in whole Judea. The numbers are just staggering as to how many people were killed. Hadrian wanted to erase any memory of the Jewish people in the Promised Land, and so he even renamed the whole region from Judea to Syria, Palestina. And this is where we get the name Palestine from. The region was named after Israel's greatest enemies, the Philistines. Therefore, the name has nothing to do with the modern Palestinians, because the Palestinian people today who call themselves Palestinians are not the descendants of the Philistines. After the destruction of Jerusalem and the slaughter of the people of Judea, the region became desolate and even forgotten. Nobody really cared about it. But then another thing happened. A general by the name of Constantine started a march with his army for the power in the Roman Empire. He began his journey for power from England, then swept through France, and finally ended up in Rome, taking control of Rome's one of the most important cities, the city where it all started for Rome. So by that time, Constantine was the master of the Western Roman Empire, but the East was still not controlled by him, because by that time the empire was divided into East and West. So he started marching also to the East, and progressively started taking control also of the Eastern Empire. Now, there is a legend, perhaps it is true, perhaps it is not, that on his march to Rome, Constantine and his army saw the sign of the cross. And that's why later on Constantine became Christian, and also the whole empire became Christian. And as the whole empire Christianized, again, the Holy Land became important. Helena, the mother of Constantine, went to Jerusalem for the search of the true cross. It is said that with the help of Eusebius, they were able to find the real cross of Christ. On the spot believed to be Golgotha, a huge church, a huge basilica was built where they believed the true cross was and where Jesus was buried. This was the original church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that was just one of the many churches that were built in Jerusalem during this time. And that's why, again, the Holy Land became important in the Roman Empire. However, we must understand that by that time, the power of the Roman Empire was much weaker. The empire divided into West and East. The Western Empire was gradually disappearing, disintegrating, and the Eastern Empire was threatened by a great Sasanic Empire. And it didn't take long for the Western Roman Empire to totally disappear, and only the eastern part of the empire was left, known later as the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Western Empire collapsed in 478, but the Eastern Empire still controlled the Holy Land, but that would soon change. The Sassanid Empire, which was the successor to the Parthian and even earlier the Persian Empire, took control and conquered the Holy Land for a short time. During this time, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was destroyed, and it is said that the true cross that Helena found was also stolen and taken by the Sassanid army. The Byzantine Empire took control back of Jerusalem in a short time, but the Christian dominance over Jerusalem was to soon end by a new power that was rising. And that was, of course, caused by a new religion that was spreading rapidly in the Middle East, the religion of Islam. After the death of Muhammad, a powerful caliphate of the Rashidun began expanding not only in the Middle East now, but also in Africa and even going closer and closer to Europe. Now, the caliphates will change, but one remained: the dominance of the religion of Islam. This also, of course, affects Jerusalem, as the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were built during this time. After the Rashidun came the Umayyads, who controlled the region. The Umayyad Caliphate conquered even more land than the Rashidun, and they really started to threaten even the European countries. Finally, the gates to Europe were closed by Charles Martel, who stopped the marching armies of the Caliphate on the territory we know today as France. After the Umayyads came the Abbasid Caliphate, which also had a great influence on the region. The Abbasid Caliphate was challenged by the Tulunids, who were also known as the Mamluks. They freed themselves from the Abbasids, and the origin was Egyptian. Eventually, the Abbasid Caliphate took control of the region. And eventually, we get to the Fatimid Empire, to the Fatimid Caliphate. Now, this caliphate is very important because during the reign of this caliphate, very important things started to happen in the Holy Land. Now, as you look on this map, you will clearly see that the Byzantine Empire is still existing up to this point. And the Byzantine Empire, of course, is not happy that a foreign religion is controlling the most important land to its religion, the Holy Land. Additionally, a new Muslim empire, the Seljuk Empire, started to really threaten the Byzantine Empire to the point that it almost lost all its territories. While this is happening in Jerusalem, the Fatimids destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that was rebuilt after it was destroyed by the Sassanid Empire. Also, many other churches in the land are burned to the ground, and that's a very big problem for the Christians all around the world. Those factors enraged the Christians in Europe, and crusades started to regain control over the Holy Land. Additionally, the Pope said that people who will participate in those crusades will receive eternal spiritual benefits. And so the race for regaining control of the land of Israel began. And there were many crusades, of course, that it will be difficult to cover all of them here in this video. This is a totally separate topic for another video. So here on this map, I'm just showing you the four different stages, four different important stages that happened. So you see the red is the first crusade, then you have in yellow the second crusade, then in blue now we have the direction of the Third Crusade. So different knights from Europe traveled different routes, but eventually the main goal was to end up in the Holy Land. Unfortunately, even if some of the goals of the Crusades were noble, many times the Crusades ended up in disasters where the knights were killing local populations, no matter if they were Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. During this time, also a lot of Jews were killed. The result of the Crusades was, however, the creation of this new nation or region, kingdom, you could say, of the Jerusalem kingdom that lasted almost 200 years and where Christians were possessing the Holy Land. It is also in this time that many of the churches that were previously destroyed by the Muslims were now restored, rebuilt, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the Crusaders did manage to govern this territory for almost 200 years. But eventually, Sultan Saladin conquered Jerusalem. And this is the story that you have, for example, in the famous movie, The Kingdom of Heaven. When Jerusalem was recaptured by the Muslims, by Saladin, Christians lost control of this holy city, and their only stronghold that was left was the ancient city of Acre, today known as Akko. But even Akko, after a while, got conquered by the Muslims. When Acre fell, the Christians lost and never regained the possession of the Holy Land. But that was not the worst news yet. Now, knocking on the doors of Europe was another emerging empire. An empire that would conquer the city that was always associated with Christianity, Constantinople. This new powerhouse in the region was, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And I can't stress how much this empire influenced the Israel that we know today. It was a tremendously successful empire that conquered all the territories you can see now on this map. It was a vast, vast empire that sometimes we forget how big it actually was. The Ottoman Empire was threatening such European cities as Vienna, and it was only stopped by the Polish army of Jan Sobieski. If that battle did not happen, perhaps Europe would be Muslim today. When you look at Jerusalem today, especially the old city, what you see are the walls that this empire built. It was Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent that built the walls of Jerusalem that you see today. Eventually, even though it lasted for a long time, the Ottoman Empire started to shrink. The Ottomans were also involved in World War I, and they allied with the Germans who lost the war. So that really ended the Ottoman dominance in the region. After World War I, the whole region formerly controlled by the Ottoman Empire was now divided between England and France, the winners of World War I. So, as you can see on this map, France, which is in blue color, took control of the territories that today are Lebanon and Syria, while the British took control of the territories that today belong to Egypt, to Israel, to Jordan, to Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. The British and the French Mandate had a tremendous impact on how the countries in the Middle East look today. Eventually, the mandates were divided into separate countries. First, the English Mandate was dismantled, creating countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, and Kuwait. But the territories controlled today by Israel and Jordan were under the British mandate for a longer time. Jordan got its independence in 1946, while the territory controlled by Israel today was left by the British in 1947 and handed over to the United Nations. Now, I must say a few things before we will move on to the more modern history. First of all the countries around Israel today did not function as separate countries before the Ottoman Empire collapsed. This whole territory was controlled for centuries by the Ottoman Empire, and there were no separate countries before that. All those countries, all those borders were created artificially by the French and the British, who were victorious after World War I and who suddenly controlled the territory that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. Also, there never was a country called Palestine. The British called this region Palestine, going back to the ancient tradition that we discussed, that this region was called by the Romans Syria Palestina, and again, it did not refer to the Palestinian people because there was no Palestinian people at that time, but the Philistines that today don't exist. So if somebody says that the Jewish people are taking somebody else's country, it is not true. There never was a country like Palestine. And if somebody is saying this, he does not know history. This history that you can follow in this episode. So let's now discuss the facts. What really happened? Here you can see in this blue color the land that was controlled by Jewish people after World War II in the Holy Land. So this is the territory that the Jewish people possessed before the creation of the nation of Israel. Because the Jewish people lived on those territories before the creation of Israel. Now here in the green color you can see the land possessed that belonged to the Arabs. The reason why it's so fragmented is because in the Ottoman Empire you could buy land from the Ottoman Empire that controlled this territory. And so Jewish people did buy land, and so did the Arabs. Now, when the British gave control of this area to the United Nations, they proposed a partition plan of this land. So, the territory you see in green would be given to the Arabs, and the territory that's left would be given to the Jewish people. And what I must say here is that the majority of the Jewish territory is the desert, so not a very good territory. But nevertheless, the Jews accepted, while the Arabs rejected this partition plan. I must stress this. They rejected this partition plan, this two-state solution. So Israel, having no choice, basically announced its independence. And when that happened, all the nations that already were created around Israel attacked this tiny infant nation of Israel. But guess what? A miracle happened, because Israel, this tiny nation, was not destroyed by 5 bigger nations. As a result of this war, Jordan took control of Judea and Samaria, which sometimes it's called the West Bank, and they also took control of East Jerusalem with the most holy sites to the Jewish people, so the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall. And Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. Another important event in modern history of Israel is the Six-Day War. This is when Israel, in 6 days, defeated again a coalition of Arab nations. Not only Israel won this war, but also took control of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, Judea and Samaria, and the Golan Heights. The Sinai Peninsula would be given back to Egypt for a peace treaty negotiated by the United States. However, Gaza, Judea and Samaria and the Golan Heights would be kept by Israel. In 2005, Israel would leave Gaza and Hamas would take control of it. The situation of Judea and Samaria, so the so-called West Bank, is very complicated. There are parts that Israel controls and there are parts that are not controlled by Israel, but the Palestinian authorities. But this is where I want to end my video. I hope this illustration, those maps that I created, helped you to better understand the history of the Promised Land. Of course, this is a much complicated issue because we're talking about thousands of years, but I tried to provide you with a summary of the most important events. And for sure, I did miss some things, I'm sure of it. But then again, I have not seen such a summary on the internet, so maybe that will be helpful for somebody. This is my end year gift for you, this summary with the maps. I'm hoping to also develop those maps and provide you the maps so that you can purchase them for your own studies. This is all in process, and this all will be available on my Patreon page. So if you would like to check out my Patreon page, please see the link in the description of this video. I am so thankful to all the patrons that support the channel. Thanks to you, I can be more independent and really this channel can keep going. I can buy assets that I can use to provide illustrations for you. So thank you so much. If you would like to become the patron of this page, of this channel, if you think that the things I'm doing are beneficial, you can support me directly by Patreon. This is probably the best way. I also have a PayPal if you would like to use that. But really any amount is greatly appreciated, and I'm so thankful for everybody who has joined this project. I wish you a good end of the year. I'm excited about the next year. There's many things happening around Israel, around the world. So as long as God will allow me to continue on this channel, I will try to present you with the best illustrations I can create. Have a great day. Shalom.